We are continuing with the Geometry Semester Review, looking at problem number 16. As shown in the diagram, segment CD is a median of triangle ABC. One thing we know about a median is it goes from a vertex to a midpoint. So if C is my vertex, segment point D has to be the midpoint of segment AB. Once I know I have a midpoint, I can mark on my diagram that the segment from A to D and the segment from D to B are congruent to each other. The question that's asking me is, what statement is always true? I'm looking at my answer choices. The first one says that segment AD is congruent to segment DB. Well, that's definitely got to be always true because of the definition of a midpoint. If you look at some of the other questions, or some of the other answer choices, AC and AD, there's no information about. There's no information at all about the angles. So the only correct response would be answer choice A. If I look at question 17, it says in the accompanying diagram, B is the midpoint of segment AB, segment DA is perpendicular to segment AC, segment EC is perpendicular to segment AC, and segment DB is congruent to segment EB. We want to know why are the triangles congruent. First thing I would probably do is try to mark those, maybe color code some things so that I can see what's going on. They've told me that B is the midpoint of AC, so I know that the segment from A to B and the segment from B to C are congruent to each other. I've given the fact that I've got some perpendicular lines. I also am given the information that segment DB is congruent to segment EB. I know I have a right triangle. The segments that I've marked show that I have a hypotenuse and a leg. So I'm looking at those triangles being congruent to each other by the HL theorem. If I look at question number 18, they're telling me that segment HK bisects segment IL. Just from that definition of bisects, I know that from H to K bisecting IL that segment IJ and segment JL are congruent to each other. The other thing I know, they tell me, is that angle H is congruent to angle K. Because the diagram shows that I have intersecting lines, I know that I have vertical angles that are always congruent to each other, so I have another set of angles at J that are congruent. And I notice that what I've marked is an angle, then a side. Two angles and the side. Notice that the side is not in between the two angles. I have an angle, then a side. If I look at question number 19, I'm given the information that triangle ABC is congruent to triangle RST, and we want to know what BC must be congruent to. Please note that order of the letters. Segment BC are the second two letters. I'm looking at the second two letters here, which is my K to L. I can name, I can look at that. I also know my triangles are congruent to triangle RST. Those second two letters are the S and the T. So as I'm looking to say what corresponds to what, BC corresponds to KL, corresponds to ST. When I'm looking at question number 20, they want to know what is the perimeter of the given figure. I notice that I have an altitude drawn from the vertex P to R at right angles, so I realize I have another right angle here. I recognize that these two triangles are congruent to each other. They each have a base length of 7. They have a right angle. They share a common side. And because I know that corresponding parts of congruent triangles are also congruent, that means that I know that if P to Q is 9, then P to S has to be 9. I'm looking for the perimeter which means I'm adding all of the outside edges together. 9 plus 9 plus 7 plus 7. And when I add 9 plus 9 plus 7 plus 7, I end up equaling 32 units. In question number 21, I've got 4 pairs of triangles shown. In A, I've got these 2 triangles. B, I've got these 2 triangles. Part C, I've got these 2 triangles. And part D, I've got these 2 triangles. So those are the groupings of triangles. I know it's a little hard to see on the copy you have. We're comparing the corresponding parts, and it says using only the information given in the diagram, which pair of triangles can not be proven congruent. So I would go ahead and color code the things that you see to make it a little bit easier to match up your parts, your corresponding parts. If I look at the triangles in problem number 1, I see an angle followed by a side, followed by another side. So that angle side side is probably the one that's not going to work. If I look at part B, I see that I have my angle, then a side, then another pair of angles. That angle, side,